Welcome to the Lost Boys, the Found Fathers podcast. I'm Gabe O'Sullivan, and joining me is my co-host, Will Haycox. We are men who have suffered the loss of a child, and through this production, we desire to offer encouragement, strength, and hope to our fellow brothers who have traveled the same journey. Welcome, Will.
How you doing, Gabe?
Doing great, man. So, welcome back. This is episode 25. This is going to be the third part in our series of Does Life Have Meaning? And today we're going to go into some practical steps of how we can overcome the challenges of loss. So, Will, I'm going to let you go ahead and get into that.
Yeah, like you said, Gabe, this is episode 25. We appreciate you guys coming this far with us. It's been a fun journey. We've been figuring things out. As you can tell, we've had some podcasts we've recorded in the rain outside, and your skylight here in your office, Gabe, was a little loud. We've done some outside podcasts, so it's been a fun journey. We've enjoyed it, and obviously we're still figuring things out. So we appreciate you sticking with us. Like you said, Gabe, this was an episode or a series called Meaning of Life, or Does Life Have Meaning? And we've just been talking about, how do we know that our children's lives mattered, even if they miscarried, or if they were just a few days old, or if they were in their teens or 20s or 30s. And we just kind of talked about how we have assurance that God cares about each of us individually, and how he knit us together in the wombs of our mothers, and just the importance of personal relationship with the Lord. And we kind of, like you said, we kind of got to how do you deal with this loss? And there's obviously several different ways to deal with it. But we just kind of left off talking about a couple of practical things you could do. We talked about some guys that we have talked to who have started nonprofit ministries through the loss of their children, and how that's a God-honoring thing to do, and obviously can help you deal with the loss of your child as well. And the last thing that we mentioned that we may or may not get into today, but we certainly will later on, is we just wanted to acknowledge those out there who don't have a good relationship and didn't have a good relationship with their spouse when they lost their child, and how we can understand that would be a really tough thing to get through. And really the only advice that I could offer is to go to the Lord with that pain, and if you're the transgressor, to seek forgiveness from the Lord and forgiveness from your spouse. And if you're the one that has been wronged, to just pray and offer forgiveness. And if you don't have any forgiveness to offer, pray that you would. And so, like you said, Gabe, all that's what we've done, and this is where we're going. So the next point we have here is just, how can you make sure your child's life means something beyond all what we've already talked about, with how the Lord assures us that it does. But what if you just feel like you need to do something? A lot of us, especially guys, would like to do something. I was joking with some guys this week at work that one of the biggest struggles my wife and I have in our marriage, that probably is something you and your wife have dealt with too, Gabe, is my wife I'll get home from work and she'll be telling me, whatever it is, the washing machine wasn't working well today, or I had this, whatever, my friend that got into this argument, and this and this and this happened, and my brain clicks into like, all right, what should she do about this situation? How should she solve this? And I'm just like, oh, we can do this with the washing machine, or your friend isn't really being smart. Why don't you just do this? And her response is, I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen to me. And so we're, as men, programmed to fix it, I think.
That's right.
So if we feel like we need to do something and we want to be productive with our time, what can we do? And to take some easy practical steps, like you said, Gabe, there's a lot of different things you can do to honor the life of your child and to honor the Lord, and try to encourage people to grow closer to the Lord through the death of your child. And we just got a few ideas and suggestions. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and we'll probably come up with more than what I put down as we go on here. But the first thing that I thought of, and probably the most important thing for your relationship with your spouse and the relationship with the Lord as well, is to take time to talk to your wife about your child. And I think we've talked before, Gabe, about a friend of mine that he and his wife lost a child, and they sort of grew apart because they didn't want to talk about their pain. They we've talked about before how men and women process pain differently. And long story short, it led to separation and a divorce. And so you're not guaranteeing that isn't going to happen if you talk to your spouse, but you're making it much less likely because you communicate, and communication is key in everything. So, maybe you don't need to talk to your wife maybe every single time you both get home from work. You don't need to come in and say, hey, let's talk about our child, our son, our daughters, whatever. But, you should be able to know your spouse well enough to know the times when it's appropriate to bring up your child and to just discuss that, just if it's as simple as saying, I miss him and I wish he was here. And I think that's a thing, to remind your spouse that you're also thinking about your child and that you're not unfeeling and you're not, you haven't forgotten, you're not ignoring that loss and just trying to carry on like there's no big deal. And you want to talk to them, you want to have that discussion about your feelings and your wife's feelings. And I think that's probably an encouraging thing. And it's something that will, like we said, just open up those doors and give you the chance to discuss that. And I know, Gabe, I told you before we started the podcast, probably my biggest failure in this area that I'm aware of is my wife has a habit of bringing up our son either as we lay down in bed or like right before we're ready to turn the lights off and go to sleep. And that can be kind of frustrating sometimes. It's like it's 11:30 and I have to get up at 5:30 or 6:30 or whatever it is. And Hannah rolls over and she's like, I miss Gabriel. And then like my brain goes through this like, I should have this conversation with her and tell her that I miss him too and have this conversation the way it should be had, but I need to get up in 6 hours and I really don't want to get into this 45-minute discussion. And I just kind of leave it at, yeah, me too, and then don't say anything for a little while. And I know that's not what she wants to hear, and I know that's probably my biggest place where I have failed to have that conversation with her. And I told Gabe probably what we should do, practical steps in that area is Hannah should try to bring him up at a more convenient time for both of us, and I should be willing to stay up a little later to have those conversations. But that's just my struggle with this, to be vulnerable with you. And what do you think about this, Gabe? Is that something you and your wife would agree with as well? This is an important point.
Man, very important point. And even just saying to your wife, how are you doing today? Those words right there can open up a long conversation for her to to A, know that you care, and then B, to allow her to express what she's feeling. And like you said, Will, like some women, like my wife, sounds like a lot like your wife. She is a night owl. Like she would rather stay up, late hours and sleep in, later in the morning. Where I'm kind of like you. I'm like, man, I'm ready to get this bed so I can get up and get going in the morning, because that's just the way that I'm wired. But in this scenario, if they want to talk about it at night, then we got to talk about it at night, because, and why is that going to come up at nighttime? At nighttime, man, that's just when, you're like, TV's turned off, phone's turned off, it's quiet, it's dark, and that's sometimes where some of those feelings can come in, and when, in the dark. And so I think, like you said, whenever they want to talk about it, man, we got to be willing to open up and listen to them. And I love what you said earlier about a woman will say, I don't want you to fix it, I just want you to listen, and I think that's the situation here too. And I think we have to be active listeners, as well, just engaging them in that conversation, with that back and forth, letting them express, what they're feeling, but letting them know, let them in and not being guarded, that, hey, this is what I'm feeling too. And you may not be feeling the same things, and that's okay. Guys and girls are different. And so it's okay if you don't feel exactly the same as your wife, but let her express how she feels. And then we don't want to tell them what you're feeling is wrong. If we do think it is wrong, if we think it's like super wrong, then it's like, okay, where do we go with this? Do we seek counseling? Do we seek, biblical, advice, on that of how, things could be, she could be helped through that. And then likewise, like, we have to be open to that too. If we're expressing ourselves and she's saying, hey, listen, you need to move past where you're at now to get to this next point, then we have to be receptive to that and not just completely guarded against it. And then we have to work through this thing together, because you up in it together.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that we need to guard our thinking and be willing to examine. You've been vulnerable about your struggles after you lost your girls with mental health, and just how that's something that can easily creep up on you. And if you're not having these conversations with your wife, you don't know if that may be for her too. I've been blessed not to have a whole lot of mental health issues, struggles in my family, my immediate family. So before my wife and I got married, where her family does, I didn't have any idea, to look for, like, is someone depressed, or she just having a bad day, and then she had another bad day, and then she had another bad day. And I could have gone into it totally oblivious. And if Hannah and I didn't have the relationship that we did before Gabriel was born, and then continue to check up with each other and to have these conversations, it would be very easy for her or me to fall down that path and not get the other one the help they need, or to commiserate and let her know that she's not alone in the pain she's feeling over losing our son. So I think that's an important thing as well, just to let them know that they're not alone, and that you love them, and you love your child as well. And I think that's an important thing. Really, just the easiest way to put it is, like, don't act like your child didn't exist. Don't try to just move on, not acknowledge the hurt, but to just, move towards, this is something we probably talked about, and we probably will talk about, more, is things people say that they think they're comforting you, or, maybe not even they think they're comforting you, but they don't know what else to say. And I've had several people at work. I work with mostly guys, in a blue collar sort of setting. And so they're probably, not to stereotype, but probably most of them aren't super comfortable talking about their feelings or talking about death. And, a lot of them, when I talk about, I say, we have a son, Gabriel. He was born September of 2019, but we also have a daughter now, and Gabriel was stillborn. And then we also have a daughter now who's 9 months old. Then a lot of them, however they phrase it, they're like, oh, I'm sure, does that make it easier to have a daughter here with you? Does that help? Or, did y'all try again in that in-between time before we had Bonnie? A lot of people seem to think, like, if you have another child, then that hurt is gone. And, it makes up for it, or replaces the child that you lost. And I think that's an important thing to try to have grace with, but also just an important thing to keep in mind for yourself, that you shouldn't place all your hopes, all your eggs in that basket of, when we have another child, things will be good, and I don't have to feel pain anymore, or that I won't miss the child that we lost because I'm going to be so busy with this other one. And obviously each child is a blessing from the Lord, but it's not good for your processing of your grief, and it probably wouldn't be great for your relationship with your spouse if you're throwing all of your emotions, all your attentions on this child that you do have that's living with you now, and you're doing that to the neglect of dealing with your feelings for the child that you have lost. And another thing we wanted to mention too was, whatever way it comes out, celebrate your child's birthday. Gabe and I were just talking before the podcast. Our son's birthday was September 30th. Excuse me, September 30th. So just a couple days ago, we're recording this on October 2nd, 2021, and so he was 2 years old 2 days ago, and we had last night a bonfire just with some friends of ours, and it was a celebration of Gabriel's life, and it wasn't anything fancy. It was just everybody come and eat some barbecue and hang out. And we talked about Gabriel, and we talked about sports, and we talked about life, and we talked about, whatever it was. We talked about church. And I think that's something that Hannah and I have talked about we'd like to do every year going forward, is just to have the September 30th or whatever adjacent weekend be a day of remembrance for Gabriel, and a milestone to include Bonnie in when she's old enough to know what's going on. And I think that's an important practical step that I would encourage you to take, is as hard as it may be for you to make it through the day of your child's birth, the day of your child's death, to just try to remember the faithfulness of the Lord to carry you from where you were that day to where you are now, and just celebrate that you have life here on earth, and that if you're a Christian, you know where your child is, and you will be seeing them again one day. And so I think that's an important thing, is try to surround yourself with someone else. It doesn't have to be a big gathering, but take some time to celebrate the loss of your child and their birthday, and their lives, rather than just sitting around and feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah, we do something similar. I mean, every year since our girls, that was 16 years ago, is we go out to the cemetery where they're buried, and we release 3 pink balloons and lay down 3 pink roses, on the grave. And now that our kids have come along, we've been doing that with them too, ever since Avery was a baby. The second year, on their second anniversary, Avery was 4 months old, right? So we took her out there in her little car carrier or whatever, and let her participate, and she's been going ever since. And now all 3 of our kids come out there with us, just as a day of remembrance, like you said. And that first couple years, we had like a gathering like you did. We did like a whole thing like the first year, and kind of did like a remembrance service, and had like food and cupcakes and whatever. And we had actually planted some trees in our backyard, three cherry trees, which bloom a little, probably, but they actually bloom about a month after their birthday. And their birthday was March 1st. They start blooming about April 1st or April 2nd. But those pink blossoms coming out just remind us of those girls, and now those trees are gigantic, 16 years later. And so we do that as well every year, and it's a special time, and it's good for our kids too, I think, to remember, like, hey, you've got other siblings that have gone on ahead of you that are in heaven, and one day you'll have more family, once you get to heaven there, that you never got to meet. And I think that's good. Also, I think it's good. I hope it's good, to help them to kind of process, loss. Like, hey, this world, it's great, but it's also tough, and you're going to go through some difficult times. But here's how your mommy and daddy have handled this, and hopefully it's given them some tools to be able to deal with, difficult times that they may face in the future. And when they see how, we haven't forgotten, we're not dwelling on it, we're not like stuck back where we were, 16 years ago in our grief, for sure. But at the same time, we're not just like acting like it never happened either. And so we're trying to convey that to them as well. And we get to have those conversations with them, when there's processing, like, well, where are they, or why aren't they here, or we have those conversations, and those are good times to remember, the girls. And obviously, I think if it's if somebody's listening to this and they've gone through a miscarriage, early term or late term, that's probably going to look different than what Will and I are talking about. We had a miscarriage when Avery, our oldest daughter, when she was about 18 months old. We got pregnant again, and then had a miscarriage at like 8 or 10 weeks. And so we don't do anything to commemorate that, experience or whatever. Obviously, we think about it, because you still have those thoughts of, well, was that a little boy? Was that a little girl? What would our life have looked like in that scenario? So it's not like we forget about that child. We just don't do anything to commemorate that pregnancy. It depends on how soon or late that miscarriage is, whether or not you feel that's appropriate, to do or not. I know I have some friends who lost kids at 21, 22 weeks. Those were, where they had to like actually give birth and the child was stillborn or whatever the case may be. And so, they do commemorate those days, because it's like this was a child that they got to see and hold, that just didn't make it. And so that's a different thing. And so it's, again, like I said, you just may do things differently, but I think it is good to not just push those feelings and thoughts down into recesses that you never access, because that's not healthy. Like, have that time of remembrance, and I think that's a practical thing for you to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And one of the other things I would encourage you to do, and again, don't take anything Gabe and I say as like therapeutic advice. We're two guys here talking about our experiences and what the Lord's laid on our heart. And we certainly don't know every circumstance. We don't know, what other things you've dealt with in the past, and how you're processing your grief. But one thing that was really helpful for me, and maybe would be helpful for you, is to tell the story of your child. And that's something, if you haven't figured out by now in this podcast, I'm not sure what you've been listening to, but I can talk a lot, and I tell. I'm a storyteller. I was a history major in school, and so like that's how I remember things. It's like I don't need to know like this is the date that it happened, and this is like 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. Remember that? I won't remember that at all. So if you tell me the story and the background as to why we were mad at Britain and all this different stuff and all the constitutional conventions that came up and all this different stuff, you tell me the story and the chronology and the motives, then I remember, and it matters to me. So that's maybe just me. I'm weird that way, but I think it's important to keep your children alive by telling their stories, by telling what the Lord has done in your life since then, whether that includes a time of struggle and frustration and being angry at God, and then He's brought you back to Him, or maybe you're still angry at the Lord. I think it's important for you to take the time, what I do, and again, this isn't like a formula you need to follow, but when I'm talking to guys at work, and I'll be talking to people from 18 to upper 60s, and they'll ask at some point when we get to know each other, do you have any children? And I always say I have a son who was born in September of 19, and he was stillborn. And most of the time they're like, oh, I'm sorry. And then also have a daughter, Bonnie, who was born December of 2020. And so we get to talk about that. And depending on how well I've known the person, I may not go into the whole story. But I think it's important to just talk to them if it comes up then or later on when we mention something relating to Gabriel or what the Lord's doing in my life. We talk about this podcast, whatever else it is, to tell that story of, how Hannah and I found out that something was wrong, went to the hospital. We dealt with the whole experience of Hannah delivering Gabriel and the days, weeks, months after, how the Lord's encouraged us and brought us to the point where we're able to minister to others and encourage them through the loss of their child. And so I think that's an important thing for you, just to be willing to discuss your children's lives and just be open to how the Lord has worked in your heart from that point till now, and how He may move you to talk about, whatever it is. You might be talking about, like I said, after this happened, I couldn't trust God. I felt like, I didn't deserve this, and He took my children away from me unfairly, and I was mad at Him for 5 years and didn't want to go to church and, whatever it is, but He used this and it brought me back. And now I understand that, like we talked about multiple times in this podcast, that Romans 8:28, that the Lord calls, for those who the Lord has called according to His purpose, He works all things for their good. And I think that's something that we can keep in mind and just try to tell that maybe the best that we can, and explain how, from this perspective, a year out or 2 years out or 2 months out, it doesn't make sense. But if you Gabe, you're 16 years out, you can look back and you can maybe see some of what the Lord was doing at that time with the loss of your girls. And I think it honors them and it honors the Lord to tell their story.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think, how do you do that? It might be, initially just even kind of writing, and of course that's my go-to, is putting stuff down on paper and journaling, so that way you kind of know, like, hey, okay, this is what I would say, almost like you're practicing, and then as that those opportunities present themselves, then you're kind of ready to tell that story in almost like an elevator pitch kind of spiel, because, and why would you do that? Well, you would do that again because it's an opportunity for you now to be a comfort to those who may need it that you don't even know. Like you might be talking to somebody, and then if you like say what Will said there about, hey, I've got a child that was born 2 years ago, but he was stillborn. Unfortunately, he's gone on ahead of us to heaven. But we also have Bonnie. And that person you're talking to, they might be like, oh man, like they might not even express it to you, but maybe they've had the same experience, but they don't want to talk about it, right? And then you seeing how you're dealing with it healthfully or healthy, in a healthy way, then maybe that's an encouragement to them to be like, okay, wow, this guy's kind of, he's moving through this, well, or he's moving through this better than I am. And then that maybe opens up a discussion for you to minister to that person, or to be a comforter to that person, to be a helper to that person as they move through their difficulties. So I think that's why it's important to not just necessarily just shut it down, because you want to be able to be able to use what you've experienced to be an encouragement and a help for others. That's why we go through stuff in life. I think a lot of times is so that way we can comfort those who need it in their time of need. And two, I think it's being willing to open up and tell that story is therapeutic as well. Like we said, so you're not burying it down. Obviously I am not a very open person by nature. Like I keep things really close to the belt, so to speak, or close to the chest, however you say that. And my default was writing, but I wrote this book that is very, very vulnerable, I guess you would say. And things that I wouldn't necessarily say to someone like face to face, I wrote down, and it's in a book for the world to read. But nevertheless, the story got told, and the story was told in an effort to hopefully encourage others who might be going through difficulties that they don't quite understand. Like we didn't understand why we were going through those difficulties with our girls, and that could, hopefully translates across multiple different genres of difficulty. But also that book was written hopefully to give God glory of how he got us through that difficult time and how he helped us come out on the other side, I hope, in a better place spiritually, in a better place emotionally, in a better place physically, that we would not have been able to get to had we not gone through a very difficult time like that. Because there's a level of superficiality that would still be to my life, certainly, if I had not gone through those challenging times. And so I'm thankful to God that he got us through that, and that he allowed us to go through those difficult times, even though it was not fun. And, I wish the girls were still here. So, yeah, I think those are some reasons that you talk about your child, and then those are some reasons or some examples of how that you can.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Gabe. I think that is an important point, that you don't have to verbally tell the story of your child. If it's, I know there's a woman that I'm friends with, I used to go to church with, that lost a daughter as a teenager, and she seems to put a lot of information on, or a lot of pictures and remembrances on social media, and when she's thinking about her daughter. And I knew her daughter, not super well, but I knew her, and I think that's another way, you can encourage others by sharing those good memories and being vulnerable about, how much I miss my daughter, how much I miss my child that I lost. Writing a book, writing poetry, whatever it is, whatever the Lord lays on your heart. David wrote songs and psalms and poetry, and that was honoring to the Lord, obviously, to the point that God chose to put some of what David wrote in the Bible. And so I think it's honoring to the Lord to use whatever medium he has given you the ability to use to tell the story of your children and to glorify Him, like you said with your book, Gabe. Appreciate you guys sticking with us here for episode 25. And Gabe, you'll take us
absolutely.
out.
So we'll continue in episode 26, this series, Does Life Have Meaning, with some more practical steps. And so that's going to follow this episode. So thank y'all for joining us today. Make sure you follow Lost Boys to Found Fathers on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And also you can check out my book on Amazon. Just search my name, Gabriel O'Sullivan, and Thy Will Be Done, and put a question mark at the end of that. Again, thank y'all for joining us. Let's not be lost. Let's be found in Him.